The material I'll be presenting to you today comes from a book that I recently published, the book that Professor Davis mentioned earlier. The book deals with Jewish out-migration from Palestine and Israel between 1945 and the 1960s. Palestine, of course, meaning the Jewish community, the area that later became the State of Israel in 1948. So a lot has been written on Jewish immigration into the country, into Palestine, and later to Israel. But my book looks at the movement in the opposite direction, Jews who left the country. And the book combines different levels of narrative. It tells the story from the perspective of the migrants themselves, looking at the reasons for their decision to leave Israel, why they left, what obstacles they faced during the migration process, and what happened to them after arriving to their new destinations. And I'm also looking at the public and institutional reactions to immigration, the institutional side of the story, which includes the migration policies of Israel and of countries of destination, and the discourse on immigration in Israel and in the wider Jewish world. The broader question, the larger question that the book examines is what was the role of Zionism and of the State of Israel in the post-war world, especially in the lives of Jews who were displaced by the events of that period. So immigration helps me to investigate this broader question. And I draw on the theoretical assumption that looking at the conditions surrounding the departure of individuals from their homes helps to understand the political, social, ideological, and other conflicts involved in the nation-building process, because out-migration, much like immigration, defines the boundaries of the state. And this means that the people who choose to cross the boundaries may put themselves in conflict with the national project, and because of national anxieties, national fears of loss, their departure may be treated as deviant or even traitorous. Those are general observations, but they are very relevant to the story of Jewish immigration from Palestine and Israel, because Jews who left the country acted against the expectations of the national community. The national community defined the land of Israel as the only home for all Jews and rejected Jewish life in the diaspora in other places as pointless and untenable. Now, since the Zionist movement emerged in Europe, but saw Palestine or the land of Israel as its homeland, the entire realization of the Zionist project was based on Jewish immigration into Palestine, into the ancestral homeland. But even beyond the practical goal of moving people from one place to another, Jewish immigration to the land of Israel was also deeply ingrained in nationalist ideals. Immigration was regarded as a process of individual transformation that required Jews to leave behind them what was perceived as the negative features of their old diaspora identity, of their existence in other lands outside the Jewish homeland. And those negative features, according to Zionist ideology, were, for example, their weakness, Jewish weakness, in the face of anti-Jewish hostility, the passivity of Jews, and their uprootedness, the fact that they were not connected to the land on which they were living. So the purpose was to leave behind, that the Jews would leave behind them those negative features and recreate themselves as new Jews. Process of personal transformation, whereby those old diaspora Jews would be transformed into new Jews, and those new Jews would be strong, proud, and independent, and deeply rooted in their ancient homeland. And we can see those images demonstrating this transformation. For example, this one showing those strong people, Zionist Jews, the model of the new Jew. You see them as physically strong, they're working the land, and they're very happy. Here's another example. This is a poster from a Zionist trade union, again showing the physical features of the new Jew. And here is a painting showing the old diaspora Jew chained to the diaspora and longing to the land of Israel. It's at the corner of the image. So you see the visual illustration of those ideas. Now, due to the practical and ideological significance of immigration for Zionism, emigration, the movement in the opposite direction, was understood as a threat to the success of the Zionist project, and it was described in terms such as catastrophe, social disease, collective psychosis, and even suicide. So very, very negative terms describing emigration. Immigration was also attributed to ideological and personal weakness and lack of moral and physical stamina. According to the traditional Zionist narrative, those who left the country did so because they could not withstand the rigors of pioneering life in Israel, or because they were too selfish to dedicate themselves to the collective national enterprise. Immigrants were seen as problematic groups of deviators and even traitors who represented the countertype of the ideal national type that the Zionist movement tried to create. And so the presence of immigrants as countertypes helped to forge and reinforce the new national identity. And this was also reflected in the terminology. And some of you may know, Aliyah, the Hebrew word Aliyah, meaning ascent or going up, is the Zionist term describing Jewish immigration to Israel. And Yerida, or descent, going down, is the word describing Jewish emigration from Israel or from Palestine. And then immigrants are called Olim, those who go up. And immigrants, those who leave the country, are called Yodim, those who go down. So we see how those terms convey a certain ideological and even moral significance. Now, how significant was this migration movement? So as you can see here, between 1945 and 1967, almost 190,000 Jews left Palestine, later Israel. This was about 14% of the number of Jews who immigrated into the country during the same years. My main focus today, and also in the book, is on the critical years of the massive Jewish immigration into Israel, the period between 1948 and 1953, when the Jewish population of Israel was more than doubled by the arrival of almost a million new Jewish immigrants, about 700,000 new Jewish immigrants, mainly from Europe and from the Muslim world. Now, to understand the magnitude of this massive immigration, try to imagine that the United States would absorb about 600 million new immigrants in a period of 3 years. About 3 years. Just to give you a sense of the challenge that the new state of Israel was facing in absorbing this new immigration, this massive immigration in its early years. Now, it's also important to remember that most of the immigrants were poor people. They came without any assets, mostly very poor people, and that the state was also very young. It was established in 1948, just when this immigration movement began. So the state was very young and lacked the resources the resources needed to absorb all those immigrants. Here we can see an immigrant camp. Many immigrants lived in those camps after arriving into Israel before they were able to move to permanent housing. And so this picture helps to demonstrate the difficult economic conditions and the lack of resources that the state had when dealing with this wave of immigration. So it is not surprising, against this background, we should not be surprised that the majority of immigrants, the majority of those who left, were new immigrants who had come to Israel in this wave of immigration after 1948. Now, about 75% of all the immigrants had come to Israel from Europe, so there was a clear majority of European or Ashkenazi Jews among the emigrating population. The minority were Jews from the Arab world, what we today call Mizrahim or Oriental Jews, as they were called in that period. The main destination, as you can see here, was the United States. 31% of all the immigrants went to the US, 42% of the immigrants went to all countries in Europe, and much smaller numbers went to North Africa and to the Middle East. Immigration to Europe and to the Middle East or North Africa was mainly return migration of people who had come to Israel from those countries, and immigration to the United States and to the Americas more generally was usually not return migration, but resettlement in a new destination. So people would go to Israel from Europe or from the Middle East and then emigrate to the United States or Canada or Brazil and other countries. The majority went to the United States. Now, among all those immigrants, there was one group of a few thousand people that attracted considerable amount of attention, a lot of attention during the 1950s. This group caused an especially painful embarrassment for Israel. This group was comprised of people who had immigrated to Israel from Eastern European countries or from the displaced persons or DP camps in Europe. Here we can see a map of those displaced persons camps. Those camps were facilities that were established by established and managed by the Allies and by UN agencies to provide shelter to people who had been displaced by the war. Here we can see a map of those displaced persons. Mainly, they were mainly located mainly in Germany, but also in Austria and in Italy. So these people who had been displaced by the war, including, of course, Jewish survivors of the Nazi genocide, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, and they lived in those camps until they were able to settle in new destinations. It was very difficult to find new destinations after the war because of restrictive immigration policies of countries in the West and because of the blockade on immigration to Palestine which the British Mandate government imposed on Palestine. Palestine was at the time under the control of the British government, and until 1948, the British government, the British Mandate government, prevented Jewish immigrants from coming in large numbers to Palestine. So, because of those restrictions, the survivors had to live in those displaced persons camps for several years. Now, after 1948, many of them were able to go to Israel, but even though they had gone to Israel, many of them did not see their future in the Jewish state. And after various time periods, ranging from several, for a few months to several years, they decided to re-migrate. Most of them wanted to go to the United States or to Canada, but because of various technical reasons, they could not go to those countries directly from Israel, and they had to use Europe as a stepping stone to their desired destinations. Many of them could not realize their immigration plans even after arriving in Europe from Israel, and then they ran into serious economic and legal troubles in their countries of destination, countries of transit in Europe, especially in Germany, Austria, France, and Italy. So those were countries of transit for further immigration into the Americas. Those stranded migrants, the migrants who got stuck, got stranded in those European countries, refused to return to Israel, and then they became dependent on assistance from local Jewish communities and from various Jewish and non-Jewish relief agencies and aid organizations. For many of those stranded migrants, the only solution was return to refugee life, which they tried to achieve by settling in DP camps in Germany and Austria. So they came to Israel from those DP camps, and then when they returned to Europe, they realized that the only solution for the troubles that they encountered was to return to those refugee camps or DP camps. Now, most of those camps had been closed already by 1951 because of emigration of DPs out of the camps, mainly to the United States and to Israel. Here we can see a picture, a photo showing DPs demanding to go to Israel. And here we can see DPs trying to reach the shores of Palestine after coming from Europe. So after this emigration from the DP camps, most of them had been closed by 1951 as a result of this out-migration. But there was one camp. It was called the Fehrenwald camp near Munich, which continued to exist until 1957 because it gave shelter to what was called the hardcore DPs. Those were the sick and disabled survivors of the Holocaust who could not or did not want to emigrate from the camps. So 12 years after the end of the Second World War in 1955, this camp still existed. This camp of Jewish Holocaust survivors still existed in Germany. And this camp also became a point of attraction for the migrants from Israel. The migrants gravitated towards the camp in the hope of receiving welfare and immigration assistance that Jewish organizations and local authorities were providing for the DPs living in the camp. Both inside and outside the camps, this camp and other camps, the main body to which the immigrants from Israel turned for help was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as the JDC or the Joint. The Joint was established in 1914 by American Jews to extend help to Jews around the world, the beginning of the First World War. And over the years, the Joint developed into the largest and most sophisticated Jewish philanthropic organization in the world. It was also the most important Jewish body operating in Europe after the war, after the Second World War. So here we can see workers of the Joint visiting childcare facility in one of the DP camps. Many of the immigrants had been supported by the Joint before going to Israel. So when they returned to Europe from Israel, they expected that the Joint would again become their main source of support. But the Joint could not fulfill the expectations. The Joint had invested considerable funds and efforts in diminishing the Jewish refugee problem in post-war Europe by sending people to other destinations, sending refugees to new destinations, especially to Israel. And because Israel was considered as the main country for resettlement of Jewish refugees, it was the official policy of the Joint not to assist people going out or leaving Israel and coming to other countries. The migrants did not accept this position. They protested by staging sit-in strikes at the offices of the Joint in Europe and by sending letters to the press and to Jewish organizations, to various Jewish newspapers in Europe and to several Jewish organizations, expressing the protest against the policy of the Joint. And in those letters, they complained that the Joint was discriminating against them because they had left Israel. They argued that the Joint was not helping them only because they were immigrants coming from Israel. One immigrant, just to give you an example of that, one immigrant who had fought in the 1948 war, 1948 Arab-Jewish war in Palestine, and was now part of a group that got stranded in Rome on the way to Canada, wrote the following letter to one American Jewish organization. Now I want to quote from this letter to give you a sense of the experience of those migrants. He wrote in his letter, "Strangely enough, I'm now treated like an outcast by the people I fought for in 1948 in Palestine. Why? Because I left Israel? I cannot stand the climate down there. Apart from that, is the policy of the Joint to force people to go back to Israel right? Not every American lives in America, not every Frenchman in France, and not every Englishman in England. I fought in Israel for 2 years under the worst conditions. Those people of the Joint have never seen the country and talk. They ought to go down there themselves for at least 2 days before they condemn others." So you can see the intensity of emotions expressed in this letter, which represents the atmosphere around that problem. And this is just one example of the attempts of migrants to draw attention to their plight in Europe. The migrants became a headache not only for Jewish organizations, but also for local authorities, especially in Germany. The Germans were determined to close the DP camp and terminate the Jewish refugee problem in Germany. They did not want to continue dealing with those large refugee camps years after the end of the Second World War. But the influx of refugees from Israel into the camps ran counter to the German efforts to close the camps. German officials negotiated with representatives of Jewish organizations in Europe in order to find various solutions to the problem, mainly by sending refugees to other destinations. Brazil was one destination, one country that was able to accept refugees from the camps. So this was one solution, trying to find new resettlement destinations for those people. But the Germans also took police action against migrants, including imprisonment, putting those people in jail, and deportation from the country. And this included deportation to Israel. Deportation of refugees from Germany back to Israel. This represented one of the historical ironies of this story. The forced expulsion of Jewish refugees from Jewish Holocaust survivors from Germany to Israel only several years after 1945. We know that Jewish refugees struggled to go into Palestine despite the British blockade on the country. So now we have the story of Jews who were able to go to Palestine or Israel, returned to Europe, and now they were forced to go back from Germany into Israel. Now, all these events took place in Europe, but they brought reactions from the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community funded the relief activity in Europe. The American Jewish community funded the activity of the Joint and of other important relief organizations, which helped the refugees and tried to deal with that problem. And public opinion among American Jews was divided. Some people supported the migrants and accused the Joint of rejecting appeals for help on account of political considerations. The Jewish newsletter, which was an anti-Zionist journal based in New York, argued that re-migrants from Israel were, quote unquote, looked upon with contempt and hatred by the Zionist and pro-Zionist relief organizations, which denied them assistance in order to force them to go back to Israel. So very severe accusations against the Joint, accusing the Joint of forcing people to go back to Israel out of ideological considerations. On the other hand, there were those American Jews who believed that the Jewish world, owed nothing to immigrants from Israel. Some letters to the editor of the Jewish Daily Forward, which was an important Jewish newspaper, also based in New York, some argued that Jews who had suffered under the Nazis and had been sent to Israel with money given, with the help of money given by American Jews, should endure the hardships of life in Israel and should not return to the land of their persecutors in Germany. And it was argued that those who return to Germany should not receive any public support. To give you an example of this thinking, a writer in one American Zionist journal accused the migrants in Germany of reversing the process and transforming the historic return to the land of Israel into the degradation of the returnee to Germany. The writer insisted that the Jewish people had no obligation towards the migrants who were the creators of their own misery. This is how she called it. She called it, those migrants, the creators of their own misery, who did not deserve any public support. The pressure by the migrants and their supporters in the Jewish press, and also perhaps also the tendency of relief officers to assist people in need, often compelled the Joint to deviate from its declared policy and assist migrants from Israel. So in some cases, refugees or migrants from Israel received help from the Joint. But the Joint could not adopt a firm policy because it constantly had to choose between two bad options. On the one hand, refusing to assist migrants would aggravate their hardships and magnify the problem in Europe. But on the other hand, it was clear that providing assistance would encourage more movement from Israel of people who would, driven by the hope of relying on this assistance. So this was a dilemma whether to help the migrants and or not help them by not help them and try to convince them to return to Israel. The Joint finally came to the conclusion that the only way out of this dilemma was to influence the Israeli government to curb the movement out of the country to Europe. So in November 1953, one of the officials of the Joint, one of the leaders of the Joint, traveled to Israel and to meet with key Israeli decision makers and to convey to them the gravity of the problem. As a result of these meetings, it became clear to authorities in Israel that emigration from the country was creating serious complications in Europe and became a political embarrassment for Israel. The Israelis decided to take several steps to confront the disorganized departure from the country. The government decided to restrict the distribution of passports and of exit permits. Exit permits were at the time required to leave. Anyone who wanted to leave the country had to apply for an exit permit. So the government decided to limit the distribution of passports and exit permits in a way that would ensure not only to limit the immigration not only to limit immigration, but also to make sure that immigrants would not encounter those problems that immigrants had encountered in Europe. And the government also decided that new immigrants who wanted to leave the country would not be allowed to leave unless they refund the state for the value of material benefits that they had received upon immigration to Israel. So immigrants received financial assistance and other forms of material assistance from the state. And the decision was that those who want to leave the country should refund the state for the amount of assistance that they received. In some cases, immigrants were even required to repay the costs involved in bringing them to Israel and maintaining them in those immigrant camps that we saw earlier. And this was a serious obstacle for immigration because many people simply did not have the means to repay the costs. And the government also decided to launch a propaganda campaign in the press against immigration. The propaganda campaign was based mainly on reports about the hardships that Israeli migrants had encountered abroad. As part of this campaign, journalists were sent to different countries of destination to collect material on the experience of disappointed immigrants from Israel. And the stories were later published in Israeli newspapers with the aim of damping the enthusiasm for immigration. in the words of one Israeli official defined the purpose of the reports as to demonstrate to the Israeli public that no mountains of gold were waiting for them abroad. And most of the reports indeed painted a very gloomy picture of the lives of immigrants abroad and highlighted their immoralities and their failures after leaving Israel. The propaganda campaign included not only articles but also cartoons. This one, for example, showing a Holocaust survivor trying or knocking on the closed doors of post-war Germany. You can see the number on his hand. You can see his grim face and bent shoulders. Again, knocking on the closed doors of post-war Germany. This cartoon depicts the immigrants as rootless people. You can see them floating above the globe. They are carried in the air by their passports, and their suitcases carry black market, slander of the country, and forgery. This is what is. Those are the words written on those suitcases: black market, slander of the country, and forgery. Those were common accusations against immigrants. Now, to me, this cartoon evokes Marc Chagall's Luftmensch, the Yiddish term meaning man of air, which refers to the impractical and overly intellectual person who came to symbolize the ruthlessness of the Jews of the diaspora. This was the very opposite of the image of the rooted Jew, which the Zionist movement tried to create. So you can see the contrast between this image of the uprooted Jew, the wandering Jew, and the rooted new Jew in the land of Israel. So this was also part of the propaganda campaign. These anti-immigration policies were important in and of themselves because they helped to mitigate the crisis in Germany, but the discussions leading up to the decisions were also important because they reveal the views of Israeli officials on a number of issues that surrounding the immigration problem. Issues like individual freedom versus collective needs, the mental disposition of Jewish migrants, and the relations between migrants and the Jewish state. I'm going to give you an example of how Israeli officials approached those issues. So, one official named Giora Yoseftal, who was in charge of the immigration enterprise in Israel, thought that immigrants were driven to leave the country not by a wandering instinct. Sorry, they were driven to leave the country by what he called a wandering instinct and lack of mental stability. He believed that new immigrants in Israel should be compelled to endure the hardships of living in Israel, or else many of them would leave. At one of the meetings of the committees on immigration, Yoseftal said that Israel should treat its immigrants the way a social worker treats a client. The state should tell the immigrants, you should stay here because we know better than you what is good for you. And this demonstrates the condescending attitude or patronizing attitude of Israeli leaders towards those new immigrants, which was quite common at that period. Another example from Moshe Sharet, who was foreign minister at the time. He wrote in his diary that the state cannot comply with the wandering instinct. So again, this term, the wandering instinct of the Jews. The state cannot comply with the wandering instinct embedded in the heart of these reckless people, must not comply with their forgetfulness of their own past, but rather should save them from the curse of eternal gypsiness, in which they seek relief from their pangs of absorption in their only home in the world. So here also we can see this notion that the Jews have this natural inclination to wandering, the wandering instinct on the one hand, and on the other hand, the notion that Israel was the only home for all those Jews, and that the state should tell them somehow that they should stay in the country. And those statements stress the ostensible old Jewish habit of wandering, which Zionism hoped to eliminate. Another example from Golda Meir's son. Later she also, of course, became known as Golda Meir. She was prime minister in the 1970s. At the time she was Minister of Labor. And she referred to immigration candidates, to people hoping to emigrate, as people intent on committing suicide. And she compared the restrictions on immigration to laws against suicide. In her view, Israel was entitled to demand self-sacrifice from Jewish immigrants, and the restrictions on immigration, in her view, did not violate any concepts of democracy, liberalism, or individual freedom. So she justified the laws or the regulations that restricted the ability of Jews to immigrate from the country, because she thought that the immigrants should also sacrifice for the collective good. This analogy between Jewish immigration from Israel and suicide was quite common. A writer of one letter to the editor of the Jewish Daily Forward, the newspaper that I mentioned before, this writer, who insisted that the migrants in Germany should get no help from Jewish organizations, he supported his argument with a quote from a Jewish source saying, "He who commits suicide loses his place in the next world." So it describes or compares the Jewish immigrants from Israel to people who are intent on committing suicide, who would not have a place in the next world. Many observers made comments on the psychological and moral character of the immigrants. One American Zionist writer speculated about what she called the morbid compulsions of Jewish migrants who had left Israel to settle in refugee camps in Germany. And she wondered whether the impulse to return to the scene of the crime animated the victim as well as the criminal, or whether the migrants were attracted by what she called the womb-like security of the refugee camp. So this is an attempt to investigate the psychological reasons for immigration, or the psychological character of the migrants, or understand the motives, what caused them to leave Israel as Holocaust survivors and return to camps, refugee camps in Germany. Now, one notable exception to all these negative statements was an account by an Israeli journalist who visited one of the camps, one of the German camps, where migrants from Israel were living, and concluded that most of them were sound-minded people, thoughtful and hardworking, serious and cautious. This journalist, got the impression that these people had decided to put the wandering stick in their hands again, to leave Israel, only after long and many deliberations, and after encountering unusual difficulties insurmountable for most people. So some observers, some writers acknowledged the difficulties of those people and did not criticize them. They decided to write about the plight of these people, their distress and the difficulties that they were facing. But most accounts were much more negative, much more judgmental and negative. So, as we see from these examples, Jewish immigration from Israel became a controversial public issue, not only in Israel, but in the larger Jewish world. The Jewish vision of statehood had not considered the possibility that Israel would become a sending country of needy refugees, who would seek help in other countries after leaving Israel. The presence of such migrants in Europe, and especially in Germany, provoked intense responses regarding the phenomenon as a whole, and regarding the moral conduct of the migrants and of the bodies with which they came in contact. The migrants challenged two central convictions, two very important convictions or ideals of the Jewish world after the Second World War. First, that Israel should be a country of immigration and not emigration. Israel should be a country that takes in immigrants and helps them to build new lives, rather than causing people to leave the country, leave Israel, and seek new homes elsewhere. And the second idea was that Jews should not resettle in Germany after the Holocaust, should not go back and live in what was called the blood-soaked soil of Germany after the Second World War, after the Holocaust. So immigrants from Israel challenged those two very important convictions of the post-war Jewish world. Because of that, Jewish immigration from Israel aroused debates regarding the appropriate attitude towards people who had acted against the expectations of their society, against the norms and expectations of their national community. And because many immigrants demanded material support, they did not only leave the country, leave Israel, but also demanded support during the migration process, their presence in Europe posed a conflict between two important principles. On the one hand, the traditional idea of Jewish international solidarity. This idea of Jewish international solidarity is reflected in the term, in the Hebrew phrase, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh B'Zeh, or all Jews are responsible for one another. This was one principle, the principle of Jewish solidarity. On the one hand, was the principle of support of Zionism. Support of Zionism became a consensus in the Jewish world in light of what had happened in Europe during the Second World War. After the Holocaust, after the Second World War, many Jews supported the Zionist idea, supported the idea that the Jews should have their own independent state in Palestine. The conflict between those two values was expressed in the notion that assisting immigrants out of Jewish solidarity would increase immigration, which in turn would undermine the Zionist cause. So we see the conflict between those two values. On the one hand, Zionism, on the other hand, Jewish international solidarity. The dissonance between these two values, which contrasted political aims against humanitarian obligations, was a source of friction and debates in Jewish communities in countries in which immigrants from Israel tried to settle. So today we normally associate conflicts in Jewish communities over Israel with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we see that in the 1950s, only several years after the Holocaust, there were political and ideological divisions over the place of Israel and Zionism in the lives of Jewish refugees, especially of those who decided to leave Israel. And yet, the positions of those participating in the debates were often detached from the personal and material considerations that motivated the immigrants themselves. Immigrants were mostly driven by issues like climate conditions. The weather in Israel was too hot for many people, like health problems, economic economic difficulties, the difficulty of learning Hebrew, the desire to reunite with family members living in other countries, general feelings of alienation in Israel, and other personal and material considerations. Usually it was some combination of all those motives, as we can learn from the statement of one immigrant who said, "I can't stand that country, the climate, the people, everything." But many immigrants were more ambivalent in their statements. Immigrants did not necessarily reject the abstract idea of a Jewish state, even if they did not want to live in this state themselves. If we try to analyze the motivations of migrants, it's possible that immigrants framed their decisions to leave Israel around specific issues like weather or health problems or economic problems in order to justify their personal decisions without denouncing Zionism. So even though they decided to leave Israel, even though they did not reject the Zionist idea, so in order to justify this decision, they preferred to focus on those more specific personal issues. They detached ideological support for Jewish statehood in the land of Israel from the personal desire to live elsewhere. So we can say that maybe the migrants tried to depoliticize immigration, to make immigration a non-political act. Now, it's also interesting that some immigrants continue to express a strong connection to Israel many years after leaving the country. This is evident especially in accounts that were produced many years after immigration. mostly in memoirs and oral history interviews. An example of that is one Holocaust survivors who in the 1950s moved from Poland to Israel and then to the United States. And 40 years later, 40 years after moving to the United States, she still described Israel as our land, our place, our home. She suffered economic difficulties and loneliness in the United States after leaving Israel, and said that moving to the United States was the biggest mistake she had ever made in her life. But other people felt more satisfied with their decision to leave Israel, so there was a variety of experiences. And to give you an even better sense of the mixture of emotions and motivations behind immigration, and also of the personal dimension of the story, I would like to end with one final quotation from an immigrant named Werner Levin. Levin was a member of the German Social Democratic Party. He was a German Jew. He went to Palestine from Germany after the rise of Hitler to power in the 1930s, and returned to Germany only 2 years after the end of the Second World War in 1947. And this is what he wrote from Palestine to his friends in Europe. These last 10 years have been a time of bitter struggle, a hard struggle with economic want, which has worn down both myself and my wife, and whose results can also be traced in both our children, and a struggle with the moral distress of a man who, by his daily work, is brought within the ranks of a nationalistic movement, and who is not able to deny his lifelong moral and mental principles. This double pressure, double meaning the economic and moral pressures, has impelled myself and my wife to take the decision to return to Germany 2 years after the end of the Second World War. There is also the fact that my wife longs to be reunited with her 70-year-old mother and her only brother. So this letter shows us how hard it was to separate economic, family, and ideological considerations when reaching a decision to emigrate. Now, in any case, we know that even though decisions to migrate are usually individual decisions, personal individual decisions, and migration is an individual act, the historical circumstances of Jewish immigration from Israel and Palestine after the Second World War dictated that the personal experiences of individual migrants were cast into the public domain, in which the migrants were seen by many as social outcasts and even traitors. The story of Jewish immigration from Israel and Palestine demonstrates the broader point of the fuzzy boundaries between the personal and the political realms. This is another conclusion of this story. To conclude, in both the academic and literature and popular imagination, the creation of Israel is regarded as a rupture with the Jewish past of displacement and wandering. But the experiences of emigrants, show that this assumption does not hold true in all cases. The Zionist movement aspired to create a sense of Jewish rootedness and permanence in the soil of the land of Israel, and to solve the problem of Jewish homelessness, which was seen as the defining feature of Jewish life in the diaspora. But the story of Jewish immigration from Israel emphasizes continuity rather than change. This story tells us that tens of thousands of Jews saw the land of Israel not as a permanent homeland or a final destination, but as a way station to more desirable countries. As opposed to received opinion, Israel was not only a country of Jewish immigration, but also of emigration. And the image of the wandering Jew maintained a strong presence in the years surrounding the creation of Israel, and the specter of displacement hovered over the early years of the state. Thank you.